The night of April 26, 1986, was intended to be unremarkable. It was a late shift at the V.I. Lenin nuclear power plant, a facility that stood as a gleaming, if slightly brutalist, monument to Soviet technological prowess. In the nearby city of Pripyat, a city built entirely for the workers and their families, the vast majority of the 50,000 residents were sound asleep. The air was cool, the sky dark, and the only light pollution came from the sprawling industrial complex located 3 kilometers away, the source of their livelihood, their pride, and soon their unimaginable tragedy. 39 years later, we still grapple with the incomprehensible scale of the disaster, yet the true horror lies not in the subsequent fallout that stretched across continents, but in the final, agonizing moments experienced by the men who were inside the facility when the impossible happened. We are often drawn to the large historical arcs, the evacuation, the political cover-up, the long-term health effects. But tonight, we descend into the very core of Unit 4, focusing on the human scale of the catastrophe. We're going to meticulously reconstruct the final, chaotic minutes of the control room operators, the engineers, the firemen, and the auxiliary staff who found themselves at ground zero of history's most devastating civil nuclear accident. Their stories are not just footnotes in a historical record. They are a testament to confusion, desperate heroism, fatal flaws in design, and the ultimate price paid for scientific hubris. Before we delve into the darkness of that final hour, if you value this kind of deep, investigative historical analysis, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing these complex, detailed narratives to light. The foundation of this story lies in the daily mechanics of the plant itself. Chernobyl was home to 4 operational RBMK, 1,000 reactors, massive, complex designs characterized by their graphite moderation and water cooling system, built explicitly for dual-purpose operation, generating power and producing weapons-grade plutonium. Unit 4, the reactor at the heart of our focus, was a colossal machine housing 1,700 individual fuel channels, each a vertical column reaching through 49 feet of stacked graphite blocks. The RBMK design was, fundamentally, unstable at low power, a secret the engineers in Moscow knew, but the operators on the ground were never fully informed of. This design carried a catastrophic vulnerability, known as the positive void coefficient. Simply put, if cooling water turned to steam of void, the reactor's power would dramatically increase, rather than decrease, creating a runaway feedback loop. This was a ticking clock built into the architecture. The men in charge on that fateful night shift were operating under intense pressure stemming from both internal bureaucracy and the relentless Soviet drive for production quotas. The immediate supervisor of the electrical testing, the central figure driving the night's events, was Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer. Dyatlov was notoriously difficult, demanding, and utterly relentless, known for his harsh disciplinary style and his unwavering belief in the robustness of Soviet engineering. He was supervising a poorly conceived safety test, one that had already been attempted and failed, and which had been postponed and shifted to the night crew, the least experienced team, due to bureaucratic delays earlier in the day. The control room of Unit 4 was a labyrinth of indicator lights, meters, and banks of control keys. It was a space designed to instill confidence, but under the surface, a sense of hurried urgency prevailed. The crew was preparing for the test, a coast-down experiment. The goal was to determine if, in the event of a simultaneous electrical grid failure and reactor shutdown, the residual rotation energy of the massive turbine generators could supply enough power to crucial auxiliary systems, specifically the main circulation pumps, before the emergency diesel generators fully engaged. This brief window, the transition period, was critical for preventing overheating. It was an important safety test, but the methods chosen to conduct it were inherently unsafe. Around 2300 hours, the power level began to be lowered in preparation for the test. The plan required the reactor to stabilize at 700 megawatts thermal. However, due to a combination of operator hesitation and the subtle, inherent complexities of the RBMK, the power level dropped much further than intended. It plunged to a dangerously low level, about 30 megawatts, effectively poisoning the reactor. When an RBMK operates at low power, the accumulation of xenon-135, a neutron-absorbing byproduct fission, stalls the chain reaction. This is referred to as xenon poisoning. To raise the power back up, Dyatlov, over the objections of the shift supervisor, ordered the withdrawal of nearly all the reactor's control rods. This was a profoundly reckless decision. According to standard operating procedures, a specific minimum number of control rods, about 30, had to remain inserted into the core for safety. By the time they finished the manual override, only 6 to 8 rods were inserted. The reactor was now running on a hair trigger, a massive power plant being held in check by the thinnest of safety margins, poised to accelerate uncontrollably. The operators, including Alexander Akimov, the shift supervisor, and Leonid Topchinov, the senior reactor control engineer, both young men, relatively inexperienced, and under the intimidating glare of Dyatlov, were now operating a machine that was structurally primed for failure, believing they were simply bringing the power back up to the required 700 megawatts. They were operating in a void of information, convinced that the massive concrete shield surrounding the reactor core ensured their safety against any conceivable internal fluctuation. The control room itself hummed with nervous energy. The clock edged toward 1 a.m. Akimov, the man with ultimate operational responsibility for the night shift, was sweating, struggling to control the wildly fluctuating power readings. Topchinov, barely 25 years old, was frantically trying to execute the commands from Dyatlov while simultaneously battling the reactor's unpredictable nature. Dyatlov, positioned in a chair slightly apart, maintained a facade of stern calm, pressing them proceed, dismissing the dangerous readings as mere instrument error or temporary instability. The power finally stabilized, though precariously, just above 200 megawatts, far below the intended level for the test, yet Dyatlov insisted on proceeding. He was focused on the bureaucratic imperative, completing the test on the schedule handed down from above. Failure was not an option in the Soviet system, and certainly not under Dyatlov's watch. At 1:23 a.m., the final phase began. Akimov gave the order to shut off the turbine generator steam supply, beginning to coast down. As the main turbines began to spin down, the test was officially underway. Everything appeared, for the first few seconds, to be functioning as intended. The power from a decelerating turbine was feeding the main circulation pumps, which were vital for forcing cooling water through the core. But as the turbine slowed, the efficiency of the pumps plummeted. The flow of cooling water to the core reduced dramatically. The water, now moving slower, began to heat up rapidly, turning into steam or voids inside the fuel channels. And here, the fatal design flaw of the RBMK asserted itself with violent finality. As the voids formed, the positive void coefficient kicked in. Instead of cooling the reaction, the steam accelerated it. Neutron flux shot up, exponentially increasing the fission rate. The operators saw the terrifying results immediately on their instruments. The digital display showing the power output was climbing at an alarming rate. It was rising so fast, it transcended the scale of the emergency. Akimov and Topchinov reacted instantly, independently realizing the grave danger. At 1:23:40 a.m., Alexander Akimov slammed his hand down on the largest, brightest, and most reassuring button in the control room. AZ-5, the emergency power shutdown. This button was supposed to insert all 2,100 control rods instantly, arresting the chain reaction and shutting the reactor down. It was the ultimate failsafe. What Akimov and Topchinov did not know was that the AZ-5 button, the supposed savior, harbored the final, catastrophic design flaw. The control rods of the RBMK had tips made of graphite, designed to displace the water before the neutron-absorbing boron sections entered the core. At low power and high heat, inserting the graphite tips caused a localized, temporary surge in reactivity, a final power spike before the reactor shut down. In an already boiling core, this final graphite displacement was enough to push the core violently beyond its critical limit. The surge was immediate and devastating. Within milliseconds, the power output spiked to over 100 times the reactor's maximum rated capacity. The energy release was so instantaneous and intense that the fuel elements within the channels fragmented and vaporized. The sudden, immense pressure of the superheated steam and vaporized fuel sheared off the pressure caps, weighing 1,000 pounds each, like popcorn kernels exploding under pressure. The men in the control room didn't hear a subtle hiss or a grinding of metal. They heard a cataclysm. A deep, grinding rumble that shook the entire structure was followed almost immediately by a sound like a hammer blow. The first major explosion, a massive steam explosion, ripped through the heart of Unit 4. This explosion vaporized the remaining cooling water in the core and hurled the fuel channels upwards. It also completely breached the massive upper biological shield, a 2,000-ton concrete slab known as Elena. Elena was tossed aside like a toy lid, smashing into the roof structure. The roof of the reactor hull was instantly exposed to the environment, and the highly pressurized contents of the core, now superheated radioactive graphite and fuel, erupted into the night sky. In the control room, the lights flickered and died, plunging the main hall into darkness punctuated only by the flickering glow of emergency battery power. The thick concrete walls seemed to groan and heave. Smoke and steam, intensely hot and carrying a horrific metallic smell, began to pour into control room through ventilation shafts. The noise was deafening, a mixture of rushing steam, crumbling concrete, and the high-pitched shriek of ruptured pipes. The immediate reaction was profound disbelief. Akimov, still standing at the control panel, initially assumed the explosion was merely a failure of the massive 4,000-ton cooling tank beneath the reactor, a non-nuclear explosion caused by steam pressure. Dyatlov, equally incredulous, maintained a terrifying composure, barking orders and demanding explanations, refusing to accept the only logical conclusion, that the reactor core itself was destroyed. In the minutes following the blast, the atmosphere inside the control room was not one of panic, but of denial and mounting confusion, a toxic mix that would cost the lives of every man who stayed. The external reality was already becoming terrifyingly clear. Just outside the control room, one of the operators, Vladimir Shashinok, stationed in a room near the main circulation pumps, was dead within minutes. He was found covered in steam and water, his body unrecognizable, having been caught in the blast wave of the ruptured pipe system. His fate was the first physical evidence of the true scope of the disaster, a bloody, undeniable sign that the problem was not a failed tank, but a core rupture. The survivors in the control room, the key personnel who were now doomed by proximity, had only moments to assess the damage. Akimov, ignoring the horrific noises coming from the reactor hall, dispatched 2 young engineers, Peregut and Proskurikov, to the central reactor hall to investigate the physical state of the core. This was a death sentence. To step into the reactor hall now was to walk into a column of pure, unshielded fission products, a column of blue-white light and lethal radiation that was now streaming into the atmosphere. The first readings that began to trickle back were meaningless to the men receiving them. The standard handheld dosimeters were not designed to measure radiation in the thousands of Roentgens per hour. They were meant to measure milliroentgens. The needles instantly pegged out at the maximum reading, 3.6 Roentgens per hour, a relatively low figure, which only served to reinforce Dyatlov's belief that the damage was localized and manageable. The actual radiation levels outside the door were already reaching 20,000 Roentgens per hour, a dose rate that guarantees death within minutes. This denial, the conviction that the mighty concrete vessel could not possibly have been breached, was perhaps the most tragic element of the immediate aftermath. It fueled the operators' desperate actions, driving them toward tasks that, while heroic in intent, guaranteed their agonizing demise. They were trying to save a reactor that no longer existed. Dyatlov continued to demand that Akimov and Topchinov restore the flow of cooling water to the core, insisting that the reactor was merely shut down and suffering from a small water leak, not an explosive catastrophe. Akimov and Topchinov, weakened and already nauseous from the initial radiation dose, understood their duty. They were determined to restore the pumps and flood the core, believing that even a damaged reactor could be cooled. This focus on protocol, on emergency procedures ingrained through years of training, superseded their basic instinct for self-preservation. They began the agonizing process of manually opening the vital water valves, a path that led them directly through intensely radioactive areas, through ankle-deep pools of radioactive water, and into the proximity of the core itself. The initial chaos and the immediate, deadly confusion set the stage for the rest of the night. The men in that control room had 39 years ago begun their final journey, not knowing that every footstep they took, every valve they turned, every breath they drew in that increasingly toxic air was sealing their fate. The explosion was a shockwave. The agonizing final moments were the slow, torturous burning of radiation sickness they were now inflicting upon themselves in the name of duty and denial. We will continue this relentless journey into the night in the next part of this narrative. The seconds leading up to 1:23 a.m. and 44 seconds on that fateful Saturday morning were perhaps the last flicker of routine humanity for those inside the control block of Reactor 4. The turbine generator coasted. The experimental sequence unfolded, and then the fatal combination of design flaws inherent to the RBMK 1000 reactor and the operational hubris of the management converged into the single greatest industrial catastrophe the world had ever witnessed. When the control rod inserted as part of the scram sequence triggered the final massive power surge, a consequence of the positive void coefficient, the reaction was instantaneous and geological in its violence. The men in the control room, nestled deep within the concrete structure, did not experience a flash of light or a gentle tremor. What they experienced was a deep, guttural seismic jolt that tore through the concrete foundations, a sound that was less an explosion and more the violent separation of matter. This first rupture, the immediate steam explosion, was a consequence of the cooling water instantly flashing into superheated steam as the fuel channels ruptured. That steam pressure, reaching thousands of atmospheres, did not simply push material aside. It disintegrated the reactor core confinement. Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer, and Alexander Akimov, the shift supervisor, were thrown against their consoles by the force. In the seconds of immediate darkness, broken only by the flickering emergency lights that struggled against the dust and steam already infiltrating the bunker, a cacophony of shrieking alarms replaced a familiar rhythmic hum of the reactor. The air pressure equalized violently, causing doors to slam inward or outward with the force of cannon shots. This first blast ripped the pipes and circulation pumps apart, turning the high-pressure water system into a network of exploding geysers. But the worst was yet to come. A mere 2 to 3 seconds after the steam blast, the true apocalyptic rupture occurred. The massive 4-meter-thick biological shield, known informally by the staff as a Lena or patch, a 1,000-ton slab of concrete and metal designed to contain the core, was violently lifted by the internal pressure of the exploding steam and gases. When it slammed back down, partially displacing and shattering, it exposed the glowing graphite core directly to the outside air. The reaction between the superheated graphite blocks and the incoming air, combined with the hydrogen produced by the previous steam zirconium reaction, triggered the second, far more powerful chemical explosion. This was the one that destroyed the reactor building entirely, propelling massive chunks of radioactive fuel, graphite, and building debris thousands of feet into the night sky, tearing the roof off the facility and setting the stage for the raging inferno that would follow. Inside the control room, the initial concussion left the survivors reeling in confusion. The dust was thick, a gritty mix of pulverized concrete and aerosolized, highly radioactive material. Visibility dropped to near zero. The air immediately smelled wrong. Not the clean, sterile odor of an industrial power plant, but a strange, sharp scent, described by some as ozone, but which was in fact the ionization of the air caused by extreme radiation exposure. For the workers caught in this maelstrom, the immediate sensory experience was overwhelming. Victor Brasnik, an operator who was working nearby, later described the terrifying noise as a series of heavy blows, followed by a continuous, horrible rumbling. The men's ears were ringing, and many suffered immediate, temporary hearing loss. Crucially, the instruments immediately began to fail. Control panels went dark. The sensors designed to measure neutron flux and power output either flatlined or pegged out at their maximum reading, offering no usable data. This instrumental failure would prove to be a profound factor in the hours that followed, fueling the deadly cycle of denial and misinterpretation. Dyatlov, a man known for his rigid adherence to protocol and equally rigid refusal to acknowledge error, demanded immediate order. In the chaos, the truth that the 1,000-ton roof was gone and the core was open to the sky was a physical impossibility according to Soviet engineering standards. The RBMK reactor was designed with so many fail-safes and layers of protection that a complete physical destruction of the core was deemed statistically zero. Therefore, the logical, if fatally incorrect, conclusion drawn by the senior staff was that a massive internal plumbing failure had occurred, a burst main circulation pump, or a large rupture in the feed water pipes. This catastrophic misinterpretation set the immediate rescue and stabilization strategy. Flood the core with cooling water. Dyatlov, his face grimed with dust and his body already absorbing a lethal radiation dose, shouted the orders to restore the feed water supply and engage the auxiliary emergency cooling pumps. Akimov, the shift supervisor, despite his own rising internal alarm, immediately rallied his team. Their training dictated that they must, under all circumstances, maintain cooling. The reality, which was slowly revealing itself through terrifying physical evidence, was that there was nothing left to cool. The core had disassembled itself. The first heroes, or perhaps the first martyrs, were the men tasked with manually opening the valves to feed water into a non-existent reactor vessel. Operator Vladimir Shashinok, stationed near the dereator tower, was not so lucky. He was one of the first direct casualties, either killed instantly by the blast or suffering massive injuries from flying debris. His colleague, the commissioning agent Valery Kodumchuk, stationed in the main circulation pump room, disappeared entirely. Kodumchuk's body was never recovered, entombed forever beneath the remnants of the reactor structure, vaporized or crushed by the 1,000-ton biological shield that had flipped over. Dyatlov, still insistent that the situation was a severe water leak and not a nuclear explosion, ordered the reactor operators and technicians to physically proceed toward the reactor hall and turbine room to assess the damage and, more importantly, manually restore the water flow. This was the second, equally fatal phase of the immediate response. The workers moving toward the core area, men like Alexander Kudryavtsev and Viktor Proskuryakov, were walking into a radiation field that instantly surpassed all known human tolerances. They navigated corridors now filled with black water pooling from burst pipes, thick steam, and debris. In the reactor hall, where moments before the structure had stood intact, they found utter devastation. The walls were gone. In the flickering light of their handheld emergency lamps, they saw the unthinkable. The massive metal caps of the refueling channels, normally sealed tightly over the reactor, were missing. They lay scattered like discarded coins. The worst sight, however, was in the refueling bay. Looking down from the shattered walkway, they could see the open sky where the roof should have been. And beneath the gaping hole, they saw something entirely new and horrific. A blue-white glow, an ethereal illumination caused by the Cherenkov effect. The speed of light being surpassed in the water by high-energy particles, testimony to the unimaginable intensity of the exposed core. The men did not spend long minutes in this field. They spent seconds, but those seconds were enough to seal their fate. Within moments, they began to feel the immediate, localized effects of acute radiation poisoning. The metallic taste in their mouths became pronounced. Their skin began to flush red, the nuclear tan, as capillaries instantly failed under the intense barrage of gamma and neutron radiation. Their eyes, exposed to the neutron flux, felt like they were filling with sand, and their vision began to blur. Yet, driven by adrenaline training and the sheer, disciplined belief that the reactor could still be saved, they continued their suicidal reconnaissance. They tried to locate the broken pipes, but the destruction was too widespread. They tried to manually turn the emergency valves, but the mechanisms were jammed, twisted by the explosions, and encased in intensely radioactive debris. Some of the men struggled through areas where highly radioactive steam jetted out, literally boiling the air around them. They were absorbing doses measured not in hundreds of Roentgens, which is a lethal dose over hours, but in thousands of Roentgens per hour, a dose that guarantees cellular breakdown within minutes. Back in the control room, the staff was now faced with overwhelming physical evidence that contradicted Dyatlov's belief in a simple pipe failure. They were encountering fire alarms, not just steam. Reports filtered back from the turbine hall, where engineer Vladimir Deshura and his team were fighting fires that had started when oil pipes ruptured and ignited on the shattered, hot machinery. The reality was beginning to dawn, piece by devastating piece, that they were not fighting a technological malfunction. They were fighting the end of their world. The immediate goal shifted from cooling the core to simply containing the physical spread of fire and damage. The fire teams, led by Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik, arrived shortly after the blast, driving toward disaster they couldn't possibly comprehend. For the reactor staff still trapped inside the building, the coming hours were a blurred agony of desperate labor, rapidly escalating physical symptoms, and the slow, horrifying realization that their strict adherence to protocol had led them to a task of sheer futility, a task that demanded their lives be spent in service of cooling a pile of radioactive dust and debris scattered across the roof of the decimated building. The clock had only just begun its countdown to disaster, but for the men fighting the initial fires and attempting to restore control, their personal clocks had already run out. The immediate aftermath of the explosion was defined less by coordinated emergency response and more by localized, chaotic heroism filtered through a thick, paralyzing screen of disbelief and bureaucratic denial. Inside the shattered remains of Unit 4, the shift supervisors, still reeling from the blast that had instantly vaporized several colleagues, struggled desperately to maintain the illusion of control. The Soviet engineering doctrine held the RBMK reactor design as functionally invulnerable to catastrophic rupture. Therefore, the physical reality unfolding before them, the shredded walls, the massive plume of smoke and radioactive particles, the searing heat, simply could not be a core explosion. It had to be something else. A fuel tank explosion, perhaps, or a ruptured pressure vessel. This fatal misdiagnosis, championed by figures like Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov and Shift Supervisor Alexander Akimov, led to a cascade of orders that were not only futile but utterly lethal to the men executing them. These workers, many of whom had already absorbed doses that guaranteed their eventual death, were ordered to perform tasks centered around restoring the cooling systems. They were told to open valves, manually override controls, and feed water into the reactor core, believing that if they could only restore cooling, the nightmare would subside. They moved through areas where the dose rates were astronomical, so high that the radiation was actively stripping the air around them of its electrical charge, sometimes producing the eerie, ghostly blue ionization glow, Cherenkov radiation, a visible marker of imminent doom. Akimov, despite suffering from severe nausea and physical distress, marshaled his team, including Leonid Topchinov, the young senior reactor control engineer, to descend into the bubbler pool corridor. This area, directly beneath the reactor, was now an absolute hellscape, filled with steam, radioactive water, debris, and the choking stench of ozone and scorched metal. They spent precious, fatal hours battling jammed valves and maneuvering through destroyed tunnels, trying to save a reactor that had already ceased to exist as a contained unit. Every second spent in that environment added hundreds of Renkins to their already overflowing lethal quotas. They were martyrs to a system that refused to believe its own failure, pouring their waning energy into trying to patch a hole where a building used to be. The irony, brutal and devastating, was that their dedication in attempting to stabilize the core ensured their rapid demise, while simultaneously buying time for the official government response to organize itself. While the plant personnel battled phantoms within the ruin, the external response began to materialize, primarily in the form of the local fire departments. This group represents one of the most immediate and profound sacrifices of that night. Alerted by the initial chaotic calls, fire brigades from Pripyat and nearby towns began arriving shortly after the explosion, completely unaware of the true nature of the fire they were running toward. They were trained to fight industrial fires, to deal with burning bitumen and electrical faults, not atomic furnaces. Led by commanders like Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik and Lieutenant Viktor Kaibnak, these young men, most in their early 20s, raced toward the burning Unit 4, armed only with standard protective gear, canvas clothing, simple helmets, and rudimentary breathing apparatus. This gear offered absolutely zero protection against high-energy ionizing radiation. The moment they stepped onto the site, they were bathed in invisible death. The primary objective of the firefighters was twofold: extinguish the widespread fires on the turbine hall roof, a critical area, as a collapse there could have spread the catastrophe to Unit 3, which was still operational next door, and suppress the massive fires roaring within the main reactor structure. Pravik's men climbed a ladder to the roof of the turbine hall, stepping directly into a field of extreme radiation. The scene on the ground was equally alarming. Chunks of black, glistening graphite, moderator material ripped directly from the core, littered the concrete apron around the plant. Handling or even standing near these fragments meant instantly absorbing doses equivalent to thousands of chest X-rays. Many of the firefighters later recounted kicking these chunks aside, thinking they were merely pieces of electrical debris, their hands and boots receiving massive, localized doses. The fight was intense. The fires on the roof were fueled by highly flammable bitumen used for roofing material, and the heat was oppressive. But within minutes, the firefighters began experiencing symptoms far worse than heat exhaustion. The first sign was often a searing, metallic taste in the mouth, described by some as a taste of lead or iron pennies. This was immediately followed by crushing, debilitating headaches and an overwhelming, uncontrollable nausea. They began vomiting violently, sometimes repeatedly, right there on the roof or in the turbine hall. This was a terrifying onset of acute radiation syndrome, stage 1. The gastrointestinal phase, often called the walking ghost phase, because the victims, despite their internal devastation, could still function for a time. Some reported their skin turning deep red, almost instantly, particularly when their clothes were damp or exposed, a phenomenon known as radiation erythema or nuclear sunburn. Yet, driven by adrenaline and duty and still convinced they were battling conventional blaze, they pressed on, passing out hoses and battling flames that seemed eerily difficult to suppress. The bravery of this initial response was undeniable, but was a bravery born of profound ignorance of the enemy they faced. As the hours passed and the sun began to rise over Pripyat, the sheer volume of injured and sick workers began to overwhelm the local medical infrastructure. The workers who had been in the most intensely radioactive environments, the electrical engineers, the pump operators, and the firefighters, were now collapsing. They were initially funneled into the plant's medical unit, and then quickly transferred to MSCH 6, Medical Sanitary Unit Number 6, in Pripyat. The scene at MSCH 6 that morning was one of utter chaos. Medical staff, many woken from sleep, were unprepared for the type of injuries they were confronting. The triage process was deeply flawed. Many patients were initially diagnosed with thermal burns or steam poisoning because of visible symptoms: the blistering, reddened skin, the extreme fever, the uncontrollable vomiting, mimic conventional burn injuries. The medical personnel did not have the means nor the experience to quantify the massive doses of radiation the men had received, and certainly not the resources to treat them. The workers arrived, stripped of their contaminated clothes, which were piled dangerously nearby, their bodies already beginning the agonizing process of cellular death. Their white blood cell counts were plummeting, their immune systems effectively destroyed. For those with doses above 4 gray, the symptoms were relentless. The initial vomiting gave way to a brief, deceptive latent period, a window of hours where the victims might feel slightly better, leading doctors and themselves to believe recovery was possible. But for those most exposed, this latent period was horrifyingly short. The nausea would return with a vengeance, followed by diarrhea. The skin, particularly on the face, hands, and legs, where the highest contamination had settled, began to swell and darken, sometimes turning the men a deep mahogany brown or even black in patches, the visual signature of irreversible tissue damage. It became rapidly clear to the few informed doctors on site that this was not a localized accident. It was a mass casualty event requiring specialized care unavailable in Pripyat or even Kiev. The decision was made to prepare the worst cases for immediate transfer to Moscow Hospital No. 6, the elite clinical center in the Soviet Union specializing in treating radiation exposure. This was the place where Soviet nuclear researchers, submariners, and weapons workers were sent when facing radiation poisoning. As ambulances began to arrive, the plant workers and firefighters, barely coherent, were loaded for the long, grim journey west. Their condition was so severe that some were vomiting inside the vehicles, collapsing into comas before they even reached the airfield. The transfer marked a tragic acknowledgement that these men were beyond local help. They were, in essence, being transported to a facility that would document their final days while attempting the impossible task of regenerating a human body completely saturated with nuclear energy. The initial wave of 41 patients, comprising the shift staff and the first responders, represented the highest price paid in the first hours of the disaster, their bodies irrevocably damaged by the relentless stream of invisible particles that had pierced their DNA. The initial moments following a catastrophic rupture of reactor 4 were defined by noise, destruction, and a terrifying confusion. But as the structural reverberation subsided in the raw, violent power of the explosion receded, a new, far more insidious phase began. The silent, invisible assault to radiation. For the workers still moving, still trying to make sense of the incomprehensible ruin. The clock was ticking, and their bodies were already losing the war. As the frantic, disoriented efforts inside the destroyed block continued, workers like Akimov and Topchinov fighting a losing battle against the water valves, desperately attempting to cool a core that no longer existed. The first outside help began to arrive. These were not nuclear specialists. They were the men who dealt with fire. The Pripyat Fire Department was alerted by the initial explosion and the pillar of fire visible in the pre-dawn sky, led by Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik and Lieutenant Viktor Kybnak. These teams rushed toward what they believed was a standard industrial fire. Their training was impeccable for conventional blazes, for electrical short circuits, or for fires fueled by oil or bitumen. Nothing in their doctrine prepared them for a reactor core spewing thousands of degrees of heat and untold quantities of radioactive isotopes into the atmosphere. Pravik's and Kybnak's men arrived within minutes. The scene was alien. The air tasted metallic, sharp, and acrid. The characteristic scent of massive ionization, the ozone produced by extremely high radiation interacting with the surrounding atmosphere. They didn't have protective chemical suits. They had canvas uniforms and standard helmets. They immediately focused on the most visible threats. The raging fires on the roof of the turbine hall and the roof of the adjacent Unit 3, which threatened to spread the destruction to the still operational reactors. This tactical decision, though logical for a conventional fire, sealed the fate of many of these men. The roof of the turbine hall was directly exposed to massive fallout from a fragmented core. The ground they walked on was littered with intensely radioactive debris, graphite blocks ejected from the reactor cavity, the very fuel rods that had just undergone uncontrollable fission. The dose rates on that roof, hours after the explosion, were lethally high, sometimes exceeding 20,000 Roentgens per hour in concentrated spots. Pravik and his crew fought the flames for hours, moving heavy hoses, climbing ladders, and absorbing doses that, within minutes, guaranteed a fatal outcome. They were heroes in the truest, most devastating sense, making conscious decisions to put out visible flames, unaware they were standing in the direct path of an invisible tsunami of death. Back inside the wreckage, the workers who had survived the blast wave were experiencing the first, terrifying physical symptoms of extreme exposure. The nausea, which initially might have been mistaken for shock or fright, intensified rapidly. This was not simple queasiness. It was debilitating, violent, and relentless emesis, the body attempting to purge an internal injury it could not comprehend. Anatoly Kuryavkin, a turbine operator, described a profound weakness that arrived almost instantaneously, coupled with a headache that felt less like pain and more like a physical pressure crushing his skull. For many, this violent vomiting was a first, undeniable proof that something was profoundly, scientifically wrong. Yet, even as they collapsed, they often continued to issue orders or crawl toward a task, driven by a deeply ingrained sense of duty and the desperate, lingering hope that the damage could still be contained. This leads us to one of the most tragic layers of the disaster, the profound failure of instrumentation and the resulting psychological blindness that trapped the victims. The majority of the standard dosimeters available to the operators and initial emergency responders, the standard-issue military dosimeters, were calibrated to measure doses up to a few thousandths of a Roentgen per hour, or at best, for Roentgens per hour, the levels expected in a controlled, operational environment or a minor leak. When brought near the destroyed core or the highly contaminated debris, these instruments simply maxed out. They either showed the maximum reading they were capable of, often 3.6 R/HR, or, terrifyingly, displayed nothing at all, having been instantly fried by the sheer power of the gamma and neutron flux. Imagine the horror of standing next to a glowing blue mass of ionizing air, your body screaming internal warnings to metallic taste and unstoppable sickness, only to look at your primary means of measurement, the device designed to protect you, and see a benign number or, worse, a zero. This failure created a deadly sense of ambiguity. Were they exposed to an irritating but manageable dose, or a fatal one? The standard response became, if the meter isn't reading high, keep working. This bureaucratic and technological lag amplified the casualty count exponentially in those critical first hours. The truly high-range dosimeters, capable of measuring thousands of Roentgens, were stored in inaccessible locations, or were not yet operational. It took precious hours, some say as many as 6 or 7, for technicians to locate, calibrate, and bring forward equipment capable of registering the true, fatal scale of catastrophe, doses in the thousands of Roentgens per hour. By then, the fate of the first wave of victims was already sealed. Meanwhile, deep beneath the reactor, in the protected command post known as the bunker, chaos reigned. This subterranean warren became the epicenter of denial and organizational paralysis. Here, plant management attempted to piece together the events, yet they did so through a lens distorted by rigid technical belief and bureaucratic fear. Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer who had overseen the disastrous test, remained present, demanding reports. His initial assessment, fueled by the limited and misleading data provided by the non-functional instrumentation and his own deeply entrenched belief in the reactor's stability, was catastrophically wrong. He insisted, repeatedly and vehemently, that the reactor core was intact, that the damage was limited to the tank and pipework, possibly a massive steam burst, but certainly not a meltdown or explosion. This denial was not merely stubbornness. It was a reflection of the Soviet technical culture, where admitting a core rupture, the ultimate failure, was unthinkable, almost treasonous. The RBMK reactor was designed to be safe, therefore it could not have exploded. Dyatlov pushes operators, including the already fading Akimov, to continue pumping water into the reactor, a futile task that only further exposed the men to radiation seeping to the flooded pipes and structures. The refusal by Dyatlov and other senior management to accept irrefutable evidence, the massive hole in the roof, the visible chunks of graphite, the sick and vomiting workers, had disastrous consequences. It delayed the critical decision to call for specialized medical assistance from Moscow and, most critically, delayed the evacuation of Pripyat, the nearby city of 50,000 people. Hours passed in meetings and arguments, trying to calculate a dose that the meters couldn't measure, while the fallout rained silently down on the unsuspecting residents. As the morning progressed, the physical condition of the critically exposed workers rapidly deteriorated, following the classic chilling trajectory of acute radiation syndrome, or ARS. The initial phase, the prodromal stage, was marked by the severe, explosive vomiting and diarrhea, coupled with exhaustion, and the flushed nuclear tan that developed as capillaries burst under the massive radiation load. However, after this initial violent onset, something deceptive happened. The latent stage. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of ARS. After the initial wave of sickness, often lasting several hours, the victims experienced a temporary respite. The vomiting would subside, the nausea might lessen, and the workers would feel temporarily better. This period of false recovery often tricked the victims and medical personnel into believing the crisis had passed, or that the exposure had been survivable. Dyatlov himself, who had received a massive, though non-instantaneously fatal dose, experienced this. He felt strong enough to argue and direct operations in the bunker, masking the cellular destruction already underway within his body. But the latent stage was merely the calm before the storm. During this brief window, the radiation dose, hundreds, sometimes thousands of rads, was systematically destroying the most rapidly reproducing cells in the body. The cells lining the gastrointestinal tract, the bone marrow responsible for producing white blood cells, and the reproductive cells. For the most critically exposed, those who have been working directly over the core or handling graphite blocks, Pravik, Kivnak, Kodumchuk, though he was already buried, Akimov, Topchinov. The latent stage would be terrifyingly short, perhaps only a day. Their doses were so high that the central nervous system itself was directly damaged, leading quickly to the terminal phase. By mid-morning, the first severely affected workers and firefighters were being loaded onto ambulances and transported to the local hospital, MSCH-6, in Pripyat. The hospital staff, though highly trained in general medicine, were quickly overwhelmed and unprepared for the scale and type of injury they were witnessing. Doctors and nurses encountered men whose skin was already turning red, whose eyes were swelling shut, and who suffered from persistent, agonizing vomiting. Yet, In another tragic layer of this event, the hospital staff themselves were often exposed to significant radiation from the contaminated clothing and skin of their patients. They were treating the sickest men in the Soviet Union without adequate protection, embodying a second wave of unintentional heroism. The decision was swiftly made by specialized medical teams, once they finally arrived from Moscow, that the most severe cases needed immediate, specialized treatment at Hospital No. 6 in Moscow, the dedicated facility for radiation sickness. This included the entire initial shift crew and the firefighters who had battled the blaze on the roof. The journey to Moscow was grim. The victims were barely coherent, suffering from intense pain and disorientation. Their fates were sealed not by the blast that tore apart the reactor, but by the relentless, microscopic energy transfer that had occurred in those first hours of confusion, duty, and catastrophic organizational failure. The workers were now classified by the severity of their internal destruction, moving inexorably toward the agonizing, inevitable consequence of standing too close to the sun. The full horror of their final days was about to begin, far from the ruins of Chernobyl, under the watchful, fearful gaze of the Soviet medical establishment. The final days in Moscow's Hospital No. 6 were not days of hope, but days of managed, agonizing decline. For the core group of 29 individuals who absorbed doses far exceeding the immediate lethal threshold, doses often reported as 200 gray, 300 gray, or even more localized spikes that simply vaporized cellular structure, there was never a chance of survival. The medical staff, led by the pioneering Dr. Angelina Guskova and the American bone marrow expert Dr. Robert Gale, were engaged in a scientific battle against an enemy they could see, but could not conquer: the irreversible destruction of the human biological framework. We must understand the distinction between the radiation injuries suffered by the brave liquidators arriving later and the injuries sustained by this initial group. For the liquidators, radiation was an acute, serious threat. For the Reactor 4 night shift, radiation was instantaneous, complete biological annihilation. Their systems were not simply damaged. They were erased. The body's capacity for self-repair, for blood production, for maintaining the integrity of the gastrointestinal lining, all ceased to exist almost simultaneously. The skin, blistered and darkened in the infamous nuclear tan, was merely the outward manifestation of the internal catastrophe. Inside, the mucosal membranes, the gut lining, the very systems responsible for nutrient absorption and infection defense, were shedding, turning the digestive tract into a source of excruciating pain and overwhelming sepsis. Viktor Proskuryakov, Alexander Kudryavtsev, and Leonid Topchinov, the young men who struggled in the central hall and under the damaged reactor lid, endured the worst of this suffering. Their final hours were marked by constant delirium, extreme nausea, and a systemic failure so profound that modern medicine was utterly powerless. Topchinov, only 23, who had the awful responsibility of the attempted scram button and the initial confusion over the reactor status, suffered terribly before succumbing to the trauma on May 28th. Akimov, the shift supervisor, held out just slightly longer, his death on May 11th concluding the fate of the two most immediate witnesses to the explosion's mechanism. There was no sense of peace, no gentle drifting away for these men. It was a violent, painful, and drawn-out process that demonstrated the horrifying efficiency of high-dose ionizing radiation. The heroic efforts to perform bone marrow transplants, utilizing donors and even fetal liver cells, were tragically doomed from the start. The damage to the rest of the body, the heart muscle, the lungs, the central nervous system, was too extensive, even if new bone marrow had taken hold. The recipient bodies were already too broken to sustain life. And then came the silence, the wave of fatalities in May, particularly among the core operations personnel, demanded an immediate, decisive, and terrifyingly secretive response from the Soviet state. The workers who died in Moscow's Hospital No. 6 could not be returned to their families for traditional burial. The reason was chillingly simple. Despite being clinically deceased, their bodies were still profoundly radioactive. The isotopes they had internalized, cesium, strontium, and others, were concentrated in their organs, presenting an unacceptable biological hazard handled or interred normally in civilian cemeteries near Kiev or Pripyat. The government solution was swift, stark, and utterly heart-wrenching for the surviving widows and parents. The bodies were placed inside sealed zinc coffins. These zinc containers were then further sealed inside wooden caskets. The families were, in many cases, denied the final, fundamental human right of viewing their loved ones. They were allowed to approach the exterior casket, perhaps touch the polished wood, but the horrifying reality of what lay within, a radioactive containment unit, was kept shielded both physically and psychologically. The interment site chosen was the Matinsko Cemetery in Moscow. The burials were conducted with extreme haste, under heavy KGB supervision, effectively transforming a routine human ceremony into a grim military operation aimed at containment. The official protocol decreed that these radioactive remains had to be secured permanently. After the coffins were lowered into ground, they were not just covered with soil. Massive concrete slabs were poured over the burial plots, effectively cementing the remains in place. This final, brutal measure ensured that the ground above would never be disturbed, and that the lethal contaminants would remain isolated for the centuries required for their decay. Imagine the scene. The families, grieving not only the loss of their husbands and sons, but also the denial of closure, watching this industrial, clandestine funeral. They were not burying heroes in the traditional sense. They were supervising containment of radioactive waste that, just weeks before, had been the vibrant, living core of their world. This secrecy, this denial of open mourning, was one of the crueler aspects of the Soviet response, prioritizing the state's need for control and minimizing public panic over the individual's need for grief and remembrance. The collective fate of the original 31 victims, the initial count of those who died from acute radiation syndrome ARS, within the first 3 months, served as a definitive and devastating dataset for the rest of the world regarding the effects of megadose radiation exposure. The suffering endured by these men, meticulously documented by Guskova and her team, provided medical science with a grim roadmap of how massive doses of gamma and neutron radiation dismantle the human body. The lessons learned were terrible, that doses above 10 gray are almost universally fatal regardless of intervention, that massive localized doses lead to systemic organ failure far faster than previously modeled, and that the long, drawn-out process of organ liquefaction and sepsis is a final, merciless executioner. The sacrifice of these workers, though unwilling and tragic, contributed to the establishment of advanced protocols for treating radiological injuries globally. Their demise became the historical benchmark for maximum credible radiation injury. However, the legacy of their sacrifice extends far beyond the medical textbooks. It is deeply intertwined with the political reckoning that followed. The Soviet system, incapable of admitting structural flaws, required scapegoats. The trial, conducted in Chernobyl in 1987, focused intensely on plant management. Viktor Brukhanov, plant director, Nikolai Fomin, chief engineer, and Anatoly Dyatlov, deputy chief engineer. The narrative presented by the prosecution was clear. These men, through negligence, poor discipline, and disregard for safety protocols, were responsible for the catastrophe. Dyatlov, in particular, was cast as a ruthless authoritarian who pushed the test beyond its limits. While the operational crew undeniably made critical mistakes on that night, isolating safety systems, running the reactor at dangerously low power, the trial meticulously avoided the central, damning truth. The RBMK 1000 reactor design itself contained a fatal flaw. This flaw, the positive void coefficient, meant that as the cooling water turned to steam, as it did during the runaway power excursion, the reactor's power increased exponentially rather than decreasing. This inherent instability, known to the scientific elite but suppressed by the Soviet bureaucracy, was a true trigger for the explosion. Therefore, the sentencing of Brukhanov, Fomin, and Dyatlov to 10 years in labor camp was less a search for justice and more an act of political self-preservation. It allowed the party to claim that Chernobyl was a result of human error and mismanagement, not systemic failure and flawed design. The workers who died, those men of the night shift, became figures used to bolster this narrative of operational failure. Their mistakes, Topchanov's hesitation, Akimov's attempts to refill the reactor, were magnified. Yet, viewed through the lens of history, they were ultimately victims of a profoundly arrogant and flawed system. They were poorly trained for the crisis they faced, working with machinery whose fundamental dangers had been concealed from them by the same authorities who later charged their superiors. The conclusion of the Chernobyl event is not merely the date the last body was entombed in concrete, nor the day the verdicts were read. The final reckoning is the understanding of the catastrophic human cost levied against a handful of individuals caught between a flawed machine and a deceitful state. 39 years later, we look back not only at the 23-year-old Topchinov and the 33-year-old Akimov, but at the entire group, the instrument technicians, the operators, the firefighters. Their deaths were instantaneous in cause, but agonizingly drawn out in effect, defining the ultimate price paid for the hubris of Soviet nuclear engineering. They were the essential components that failed when the machine failed, the human shields that absorbed the unfathomable energy released by the explosion. The physical containment of the sarcophagus, and later the new safe confinement structure, is the global architectural response to the accident. But the permanent concrete ceiling of the graves at Matinsko Cemetery is the tragic, personal conclusion of the event. It is a lasting memorial, not only to the men but to the impossible task faced by those who tried to save them, and the unforgivable secrecy that led to their demise. Their story serves as a permanent, chilling warning. The immense power of nuclear energy demands not just competence, but absolute transparency and an unwavering commitment to human life above all political or systemic pride. The final moments of the Chernobyl workers were a horrifying demonstration of physical suffering, but their legacy is an enduring call for responsibility, etched into the very soil where their radioactive remains are confined. If this exploration into the final, agonizing moments of the Chernobyl night shift has illuminated the true cost of that disaster, please take a moment to hit the like button. Subscribing to the channel ensures you receive more deep dives into the historical, technical, and human narratives of Chernobyl and other defining moments in history. Thank you for watching, and we will continue our investigation into the echoes of April 26, 1986.